Hi, I'm Sarah Daymond. I'm very nervous to be here. How are we all doing today? This is my first full day out of the house since having my foot surgery in early May. And this entire time, Rick has been the most understanding boss in the world. He is not only a great MC, he is a fantastic team leader. So when you see him, tell him what a great guy he is, and he will love the attention. You're welcome. All right, so this is Blending the Threads, Nonlinear Moments and Linear Narratives. So for 2 years, I worked on one of PikPok's biggest titles, Rival Stars Horse Racing. It's a mobile title, it's also a PC title, and it has a very linear story. And when I came onto the title, the story was already set. And it took a while to figure out what can you add to something that's already done. But what do I mean by a linear narrative? Let's just get that up here first. So when I was a kid, I had extremely unmedicated ADHD, and I loved stories, but I found that I loved stories in games because I could take them at my own pace, and then I could go and spend ages just doing some mini game in the background and then get back to the story. But also you have fantastic mobile games with linear stories. If you've played Love and Pies, it's a delight. If you haven't played Love and Pies, it's a delight. And in my recovery, I've been watching a lot of long plays of story-heavy games like the Ace Attorney series, because if I watch people playing more sandboxy games, I get angry when they make the wrong choices. But if it's just like, I know the story, it goes in one direction, I know how this goes, or I don't know how this goes, but I know that they're not going to make any bad calls, I can watch in peace. But for a linear narrative specifically, like these are stories being told to you. You're not an active participant in the flow of the narrative, but you are an active participant in getting it from start to finish. A movie will just keep going, but a video game will just stop and stare at you, and you have to press the button for it to go onwards. So a lot of people will say like this is similar in structure to a movie or book, but yes and no, because movies and books all have their own different types of structures. I've studied both. You couldn't study much in terms of narrative design when I was younger, so I studied film instead. Now, we have, in most games, it's story beat, gameplay, story beat, gameplay, story beat, gameplay. This is especially true in Rival Stars Horse Racing. It's true in most games. If any of you have played MMOs, you get the quest, you go kill 20 villagers, you come back, you get the quest reward. Then you can either get another quest on the main storyline, but then other quests start popping up. If you've got your job quests, you've got tribal quests. I've played a lot of Final Fantasy XIV. But you'll also notice that if you've played any of the games from the previous slide, these broad strokes that I'm going to start describing here aren't exactly accurate all of the time. But a linear narrative is not a sandbox. It doesn't give you choices. It doesn't have multiple endings. And you don't get romance options. I ported this from Google Slides, and that was one of the casualties. So no, these games might have romances in them, but you are not the person making that romance happen. The characters are making that romance happen, and you're pressing the button. But emotional investment is transformative. There are the story beats and gameplays, but there's this fantasy that ties it all together. And when you're going through a long span of gameplay between story beats, that fantasy keeps the story beat going in the player's mind. So, Rival Stars Horse Racing. Handed the keys to a rundown ranch, it's up to you to restore your family's legacy and become an equestrian legend. With the help of a host of colourful characters, you'll raise charming foals, manage your dream stable of horses, and bring the ranch back to its former glory. Has anyone here heard of or played Rival Stars Horse Racing? Wow, the non-PikPok faces as well. That is the Steam description of the game. Each Each platform for the game has a different description because they're targeting different players, but that's not my area, so I'm not going to talk too much about it. So the linear experience of Rival Stars, this is what the game launched with. 20 chapters in what is now known as flat racing. There was only flat racing in the game when it launched, only one horse breed. And this was 5 years ago now. They've recently celebrated their 5-year anniversary. And of all of the colourful characters in Rival Stars, their character arcs start and continue and wrap up in those 20 chapters. So my first thing when I came on, when I started at PikPok, was to make 3 chapters of a new mode happen. Rick had done the groundwork in creating new characters for this, but we needed 3 chapters of content in a new location and a new mode, but mostly using the same existing characters. Only 2 new characters had been created for this new mode, and everything else had to be communicated by the existing cast, who had fully realized character arcs in the main storyline. And the new cross-country storyline was going to be able to be played at any point while you were playing the game. And then after those first 3 chapters were relatively well received, we did another 3 chapters with the second of the new characters. And I'll go into how we did that later. So when you start Rival Stars Horse Racing, there is this voice-acted section from your mentor, Francis, who tells you the background of your character, that your grandfather was a great horse racer, your father was also a great racer, but your father died tragically under strange racing-related circumstances. The ranch went to ruin, and now he's thanking you for coming back and taking the ranch into your family again. It is the only voice-acted part of the game, and there's been debate as to whether or not it belongs in the game. So far it remains in, which I'm thankful for. But these are the story beats and gameplay. You start the game, you get that welcoming intro from Francis, and then this is how you start getting the missions from that point on. You get your little story beats where he tells you what you have to do, and the gameplay is the justification for why he's telling you to do that. But this I got to change a little recently on the PC version because we introduced a new feature called Legacy Horses. And Legacy Horses was inspired by something that Rick introduced to the game before I started, which was naming your ranch. So originally, you just had the ranch, but then you can name the ranch whatever you want. You can have a range of different pictures. You can have a range of different colors. And it didn't do much to the gameplay or anything. It's just a sign that you can see hanging in the background there behind Francis that is constantly there on the landing page of the game, a reminder that this is your ranch. And there's also a tag that just refers to your ranch by name. So if you've called it anything inappropriate, that's what he'll be yelling at this point in time instead of the lovely Moonstone pastures. Now this is the beginning of the changed flow for the Legacy horse, where Francis is telling you to head to the stables to meet a very special someone. This is only on the PC version, by the way, which has the horse creator. And the whole reason for introducing this new feature was to make sure that the player could create their dream horse from the very start of the game. So you can create your dream horse from the very start of the game. And then you can name it whatever you want. And another thing that Rival Stars does that's really fun narratively is this idea of being commentary friendly. So every time you're in a race of the flat racing, there is a commentator. They hired, I think, the guy from the actual Melbourne Cup to yell all of these names. So you've got Zombie Snow coming up on the backside. Awesome. It really feels immersive because this horse Zombie Snow that you've created is being recognized within the world of the game, even though it doesn't change the gameplay at all. And we also managed to get a tag in for the name of this legacy horse. And on top of that, what I'm quite proud of is I managed to get permission to change several missions throughout the entirety of the main storyline, the 20 existing chapters, to change several pivotal story beats so that it refers to you and your horse instead of just referring to you in the singular. And the reason why I wanted to do that was because it's the fantasy. The horse fantasy isn't just about you as a writer, it's about you bonding with a horse. And it took me a while to really appreciate that. I'm not a horse girl myself, but we have a few in the company. I have a few that are friends, and I really tried to get into understanding that mindset of why do people love horses and rival stars horse racing so much. And it's about loving your horses. It's not about you being great, it's about you and your horse being great together. And like you can see, lots and lots of references to you and your great horse, in this case, Zombie Snow. So that is the horse you have created with an avatar you have designed for yourself in silks that you chose from what was available at the start of the game. So this isn't inherently narrative as most people would think it, but this carries the fantasy of the narrative forward between story beat to story beat as you are playing the game. This isn't just a generic rider on a generic horse. You created this horse as directed by the narrative. You chose your silks as directed by the narrative. You are writing on behalf of your stables, your ranch. So without a word of dialogue, this has cemented who you are in the game. And every chapter continues on like that. Part of what has some non-linearity as well is you can complete most of these missions within each chapter at your own pace. You don't have to do them in the order that they are delivered. And because Zombie Snow, or your legacy horse, starts at level 3, grade 3, I mean, levels and grades are different things, it means that in terms of gameplay itself, for the first few chapters of the game, your horse is going to be better than any of the competition. It's not inherently narrative, but it delivers on the fantasy that you are this amazing rider that's come out of nowhere to beat all of the competition. And then we get those story beats again. I picked this one in particular because he is referencing both the ranch name tag and the horse name tag. And on the back end, this is all it looks like. It's really, really simple on the back end, but playing it, it has recognized who you are, where you're from, what you've chosen to represent, and who your horse is. So what do you do with these tougher restrictions in terms of writing just story when you don't get the chance to change anything in terms of designing new modes? I was very lucky with getting to work with the PC team on the legacy feature. So you can't contradict the main story, like I said. You can't change any character arcs, those are set in stone. You can't have any crossover. And you can't reduce the impact of anything from the main storyline. The second that you try and make something that is better than something that's gone before in the same game, I mean, if it's supposed to come after, that's another thing. But if you can engage with any of these things at the same time, they need to have equal weight, which is, as I said earlier, incredibly difficult when you've got all of your main characters with established character arcs. So here are the main characters of Rival Stars Horse Racing. Francis, Sophie, TJ, and Richard. Richard is your typical rival guy. TJ is your really enthusiastic training manager. Sophie is Australian, as it says there. And Francis is your surrogate grandfather figure. And over the course of the game, they all have their strengths and weaknesses come to play. They get stronger as people, they bond. It's a very found family kind of story. And then for the first 3 chapters of Cross Country, we were introducing Kay, who teaches you how to ride cross country. And it took a lot of work figuring out how can she make a difference to these people's lives without making a difference so dramatic that you go back to the main, wherever you are in the main storyline, and you feel like you're talking to a different person, because that is immersion breaking to the extreme. If you've played JRPGs like Persona, and you've really developed a friendship with another character, and like you are tight, and then you get to the main storyline, and like you're close, but they're not treating you like you're their best friend in the world. It's like, oh, yeah, like that was a side path that I did. Couldn't do that here. There are no side paths in Rival Stars Horse Racing. And in the next 3 chapters, we introduce Khadija, who is the second rival of the mode. And one of the challenges there was, how do we introduce a rival who is not the existing rival of the game and is appealing in her own way? You'll have to play the game to see how we did. No, I'll tell you some more about it later. So creating new threads from the old. For creating a new plotline for Francis, I managed to find the original bio for him, written by the original person who wrote the game all of those years ago, who is no longer with the company. And I had to think about things like, he's your mentor figure, so he's kind, he's encouraging, he's patient. He knows the history of the ranch, you can use that. He knows the character's family, we can use that, but can't use or reference his anger issues, which he resolves over the course of the main plot. His feelings over your father's death, that resolves over the course of the main plot. So you have a fully realized person, and you know at each point of the story, like it says here, when he goes through the things that he's going through. But who is he outside of his character development, which is it's its own topic, really. What is the character outside of their character growth? So what we ended up going with was, as you become more proficient in cross-country riding, and you start looking for a sponsor to send you across the world, he starts getting asked questions about the history of your ranch as people start interviewing you and your team to find out where you came from, why you've transitioned to a different form of racing. And through that, he starts finding emotion and a stronger sort of sense of connection to you and the rest of the team as he realizes what his place is in this ranch, and that he's not just a relic of the past, he is a really important part of who the team is in the present. Does not contradict anything from the original storyline, thank God, but it is a logical step in his character identity. So digging into the fantasy, I went into the picture mode to get a good shot of zombie snow for this, so just look at the horse. So who is your audience? That's a really important thing. It was easy to understand with Rival Stars Horse Racing. The game had been out for 3 years already. There was so much research into who the audience was, but for your game, who is your audience? What do they care about when they're playing your game? So, which also ties into, why do they play your game? How do they play your game? So something with Rival Stars Horse Racing is a lot of players are very invested just in the horses, and there are other players who are invested just in the live races. So your game might have just one type of player, but more likely you have people who are playing for different reasons. Like, there is a whole subset of players who play Red Dead Redemption 2 just for the horses, because it has some of the best horse games. I've got someone nodding in the audience. So people might play your game for reasons that you don't yet understand. 5 minutes remaining. Right. I'm almost done. So what can you learn from them? How can your gameplay tell a different story? So looking back at some of the examples I gave at the beginning, in the Ace Attorney games, you're a lawyer seeking the truth. And there are several instances in those games where, just like the normal gameplay that you've gotten used to, you have to present the truth when you don't want to. You have to show a piece of evidence that is damning to you or someone you care about, and the game will not go forward if you don't do it. But it's in your hands to make that happen. I've had times in games where, like, my favorite character got killed off, and it was a story moment, and all I could do was sort of get up and go for a long walk and then pick up the controller again and be like, all right, let's see why this happened. You don't have to have a lot of text on the screen to tell the story if you are delivering on the fantasy of what your game is. The gameplay can tell the story for you. And finally, I have a bunch of pictures here that I took off Facebook. I sometimes go digging on there, just looking up the word legacy, because the legacy feature was the last thing I did on the team, and it was very narrative driven. And it just means a lot to see that people who have played the game, like, this is stuck with them, that they love the fact that there are legacy horses in the game and they can have this entire lineage. Like, they might not even remember the story, but they remember this horse and what it meant to them, and the horse's legacy, as it was, because once your horse gets to a certain level and they have foals and those foals grow up, and if that foal is better than the parent, then you can make that horse your next step in the legacy. And this one was my favorite. So I'll leave that on that for a second, and then thank you for listening.
Do you think that the character of Sophie in Rival Stars Horse Racing is such a spicy and contentious character because she is Australian?
I don't think it's because she's Australian. I think it's a mix of design choices as well as gameplay choices. She, as a character, she has a couple of moments where she is, nagging, but she is associated with the missions that the players really hate. She is the face of the missions that ask the player to sell their beloved horses. So I think she could be the nicest character in the world and not even Australian. And the players would still hate her because they see her as the person forcing them to get rid of their horses.
That's a really interesting thing to bring up, is that because she's linked with these missions that are emotionally challenging, that's how people feel about her. I just wanted to ask, sort of along those lines, if you had anything else to say about, I guess, designing meta-narrative through this, right? Because even if you're telling a linear story, people are developing this story of them playing the game. And so when it's like, this darn Australian made me sell my beloved horse, I hate her now. Like, are there any other kind of gameplay mechanics that you think really led to personal narratives like that?
Yeah, well, a good example of that in Rival Stars is the rival character Richard. So all of the missions against him, if you get first place, he has a certain piece of dialogue that pops up, but if you get second or third place, a different piece of dialogue pops up where he gloats about beating you. And so on social media, there are tons of people saying, I cannot stand this guy. The next time I face off against him, he is going down. I will end him, and just like asking for tips, like, all right, how do I beat this guy? I'm not letting him gloat against me again.
And that's awesome, because that means, even if it's linear, right, you're having people who maybe they beat him first try, and so they have a slightly different take on that character.
Yeah.
You just managed to put non-linearity in there.
Yeah.
Amazing, thank you.
I'm interested in you were talking the difference between like the agency of the character that you're playing versus the player's agency. How do you find like balancing that, or do you have any tips on balancing that?
Well, something that I like to think about is, like, again, tying it back to the fantasy, and are you going to make the player, like, acting as the main character, do something that betrays how they feel about the game? There was one game a few years back that I just stopped playing entirely because I was so fed up with what the storyline was making the main character do, and I realized I can just choose to stop playing. I don't have to suffer through this to get to the rest of the story. So I guess a really important thing there is like testing and asking people, like, does this make sense to you? Are you still like on board with the main character's actions? Do you wish that they would do something different? Are you on board with them every step of the way? And if your main character is like even a villain who's killing people, is the player on board with that? Because as long as they're on board and like the fantasy is in place, they will develop that trust in you and the game as a whole. I mean, other things might make them lose trust in the game, but they might at least have faith in the narrative.
So I'm curious regarding like what your stance is on retcons and if that's like an absolute no in your book, because I've seen like video games or like franchises in general like go in a different direction or decide to backtrack in their stories or characters sometimes. Is that something that you guys absolutely don't want to do, or like under what circumstance would you be forced to have to do that?
Well, I'm not inherently against it because sometimes you find that the story that you're telling isn't the story you started telling. In the case of this game, I had to adhere to the story that was in place. I could not change anything in the main storyline when I was writing the cross-country chapters, so I wasn't allowed to retcon, like it was just not a thing on the table. But if it is on the table and it feels like the best choice for what you're working on, then it's the best choice. Like it's not about whether or not retconning is good. It's if it's the best choice for your project, then you should absolutely do it.
You were just talking about the restrictions with the storyline in that game, and the one thing I kind of thought of was how cosmetics changed the game. And I was wondering if you have any connection with the art team about the cosmetics and how they're designed and relate that to the story.
So for Rival Stars specifically, there isn't a lot of communication between us and the art team because we usually come on for the bigger story moments, whereas the game creates a lot of cosmetics for the horses specifically, and that is on a more of a rolling timeline. But I absolutely believe that some of the more like valuable and sought after coats mean a lot to our players, which is part of why I pitched the idea of the legacy horse, that if a player could, at the very start of the game, create a horse with like their dream cosmetics, that creates a sense of investment because like that is their dream horse. That's what they always wanted. So I think cosmetics matter a lot. And when I do work with the art team I have on other projects, that, what's the wording I'm looking for? Like that cohesion is really magical.